8:15. You know what time it is?
Extra shot.
The Extra Shot, aka the Shotty. Do you have a household name for this at home? I want to know. What do you guys call it? Like, oh, it's time to log on because the Shotty's on. Or
The
extra
shot.
shot.
Or
Like, what do you call it?
Or that one thing with those girls.
Or the girls?
The ladies?
Yeah,
Who
that
knows?
thing where they have laptops on their laps here. Well, I hope you guys joined us for Morning Blend from 5 to 7. If not, well, thank you for joining us here on Extra Shot. Leave your comments. You know, we always implement your comments into our conversation. And we begin today with this interesting story. We've been talking a lot about housing prices in Northern California because, well, naturally that's where we're at. And we talk about how expensive it is in the city compared to Sacramento, but even how prices here are on the rise. But let's talk about the minimum wage that people need in order to live a sufficient life across the country when it comes to housing prices.
Yeah, and it's probably not incredibly surprising for most of you because, as we know, the real estate market, especially in California at least, is so hot right now that it's difficult to get into a home. One, because it's so competitive and a lot of people are outbidding one another.
Right.
And also because you just have to have so much money to be able to do it. And so there is a story out from Huffington Post that says full-time workers who make minimum wage cannot afford a 2-bedroom rental home in any state in the United States. In any state without spending more than their recommended 30% of their income. And so this is from a report from National Low Income Housing Coalition. So basically what they're saying is that the results showed the hourly wage needed for a modest 2-bedroom rental, are you ready for it?
Okay.
More than double the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour in all but 4 states. So they're saying in order to be able to afford a home in California, you need to make $30 an hour for a 2-bedroom home.
Wow.
Yes.
That actually makes a lot of sense when you look at it like that.
It's insane, though, when you think about the fact that when you look at this state comparatively, I mean, people don't make that. And in Oklahoma, you have to make $14 an hour to be able to afford a 2-bedroom home, just for some perspective. Hawaii, $35 an hour. Texas, $18 an hour. And again, this is for rental properties. But California is certainly one of the highest on this list next to Hawaii. Florida, you got to make $20 an hour. And so it's just... it's a little bit of you know, a slap in the face to the people who work so hard. We're seeing actual job growth. We're seeing the numbers coming out this week about the amount of Americans who have had jobs and the amount of people who are no longer unemployed. But we're not seeing the low income and the amount that we all make as a minimum go up as a result of those jobs becoming filled. So basically the minimum wage has not gone up enough to support the other things that are going up around us every day, and that includes housing.
Yeah, and I'm reading here California's minimum wage, $10.50 per hour. Does that sound about right? I mean, that's what it's saying here, so obviously it's the facts there, but when you were growing up, I lived in California growing up, I made under that, but it was a different time. I think I probably made about $7.25.
And you were like probably what, high school, college?
Yeah, it was high school.
You weren't expected to take care of
I
family,
didn't
pay
need
bills,
that.
and do all this stuff on that amount of money. So like even when you talk about to be able to afford a 2-bedroom rental, you're not talking about then groceries. You're not talking about electricity, water, gas, gas for your car. You're not talking about being able to buy your kids school clothes. You're not talking about all of that. This is just to have a roof over your head. Right. So yes, you need to make that amount of money to be able to not be homeless. But then, what am I gonna eat?
Right.
Like then you start tacking on other dollars and other
keep the lights
expenses.
on.
Exactly. So it's more than this. More than this when you include just being slightly comfortable.
Right.
And you know, the other part I think too that we talk about often is the expense of being able to go to school and get an education, and then is it worth the money you're putting into getting that education when it comes to getting out of school and not having a house? So a lot of people now are choosing to live at home longer because of that. You know, they're coming out with all this student loan debt, or the job that they went to school for has been filled and they're not finding a place to work because the market is just flooded with a lot of these very educated people now. And so the difficult part is, all these people are having to stay at home longer. I know a lot of my friends staying under their parents' insurance until 26 was a known thing in a lot of my friend-based groups, and also staying at home longer after college, moving back in with mom and dad.
Yeah, that's not uncommon in this generation. So many of my friends did that, fortunately. Well, no, I say fortunately for me, I didn't have to, but that is actually incorrect. Because after college, I lived on my own, but I was working for a news anchor in Los Angeles as her assistant. I would stay with her a lot of times because my assistant work consisted of me like needing to be around in the downtown LA area. But I did move back home. That was home base for me until I got my job in Las Vegas. But I know it's a different time. My mom's generation, my dad's generation, right? You got out of the house, they got married right away. My dad went into the Army, then they moved to Hawaii, and the rest is history. But now it is so different because, the affordability factor. You just can't afford to live on your own. I could barely afford, and thank goodness for my parents, to get through college and live in Southern California, in downtown LA. So it's sad when you think about that.
And you talk about minimum wage being about $10.50. I know that there are legislative measures being passed now to raise the minimum wage, but that is far from the $30 an hour minimum that this study is saying you need to make in order to afford a 2-bedroom rental. I mean, that there is too much of a gap there for someone to be able to afford it with the minimum wage.
Yeah, January 1st, 2017, minimum wage increased from $10 to $10.50, so up 50 cents. And we weren't the only state to go through this. In Vermont, minimum wage went up to $9, up from $8.60, so they had a 40-cent increase. Massachusetts, minimum wage increased $1 from $10 to $11.
And we have a lot of good comments. Andre Garces says, minimum wage is for starters, not meant to be careers. Raina Sharma says, how about people already working in employers don't match the minimum wage? New workers are making more money than older workers. And then Angelina Miller says, we need rent freezes so people can afford to live. The cost of rent is why many people are homeless.
Yeah.
So a lot of people chiming in.
And there was a story out a couple of years ago out of San Francisco where there was a laundromat on the corner of this neighborhood that had, I think the rents were frozen for many years on this one particular street in San Francisco. So while all the other rent prices were skyrocketing, these people were getting away with $1,000 or less for their units, which is really a steal in San Francisco. So since the landlords couldn't go in and raise the rent because that wasn't allowed, they went in and shut down the laundromat. Because where are these people going to go do the things that they need to survive? So they turned it into a coffee shop, a restaurant, or something else. And that then started to push people to have to look for different places to live because they didn't have a car to get around to go wash their clothes. They didn't have the money to take a cab somewhere. So they started pooling the resources from these communities that really needed them because they were locked into these rent prices. Eventually people left.
Right.
They were able to clean up the building, hike up the rent. Because once all the tenants are out, you can now do what you need to do. And so it's just so sad. And I know that's a city like San Francisco where a lot of places in the country are not like that. But we're seeing those rent prices start to trickle over into Sacramento, which is almost 2 hours away. And so, we're starting to see the effects of this all over the place.
Yeah, and Christian Cavallo has a couple of comments. These housing prices are reasons why the millennial population chooses not to buy. A majority of that generation lives with roommates. And he also says, I think this conversation is more about housing prices and not so much about the minimum wage. Which, if you want to talk about housing prices and minimum wage, or just if you're salaried, again, if you're in certain states, you pretty much start to assume after a while that maybe you can't afford a home. Now, that's the conversation that I find in California. My friends who live in Atlanta or Charlotte, who live in Charleston, who are in southern states, Houston, they don't have these conversations. Pretty much every friend that I have that is in the South owns a home. A lot of them are flippers and they own multiple homes and rent them out because you can get a house in Atlanta for $180, put a little work in it, $200,000, a $200,000 house, sell it for maybe $240 with all of the new amenities. So we're not having that conversation there in regards to what is considered affordable. That's a big city conversation, a big state conversation, California, New York.
And the taxes go into that.
Taxes go into that and everything else.
I do always watch the HGTV shows when they're doing, all the different housing shows where they're going to different cities and trying to buy a house. I will say, when I see places like the Carolinas or Texas or even some of the Midwest states, Michigan, you can get a house for a quarter of the cost that is twice as big. And it really puts into perspective, what do you want out of life? Is the American dream still to own a home? I mean, this particular story is just about being able to rent one, to be able to afford to rent. But is that still part of your American dream, is to eventually own a home? I'm curious to see if that is starting to shift for people.
I think, we're on the older end of the millennial spectrum, but when you talk about the American dream and is it to own a home, I know personally, yeah, that's part of my dream, but for a lot of friends, no, it's to travel the world, and not just say that as like, oh yes, go travel the world. Like now that's a reality.
Yeah.
People are traveling a lot more, and they want to do that, and they find that the small space living is more appealing because you get to save more money to travel, to go, because when you talk about travel, you talk about posting to social media and creating that life that people see. I think it's so much more of a visual generation where it's, if it's not on, what's the common saying? If it's not on gram, it didn't happen. Like if you don't have the pictures to prove it, or the videos, or the boomerangs, or the Snapchat story, or the IG story to prove it, like it didn't happen. When you have a house, it's like, you're private about it. You don't want to be showing the inside of your house, where you're located, all these different things. So to answer that question, I don't think having a home for the millennial generation, even younger than us, is necessarily the dream. It may be part of it one day, but it's not in the near future. It's not like I'm going to save my money to buy a house. I'm saving my money so I can go on these extravagant vacations, to travel.
I want to bring in David's comment. I don't know if you saw this one, Cornelia, yet, but David says, 35 years ago, as a cook in a nice Seattle restaurant, I made $11 an hour. My rent was only $300 a month, and I complained about it. Now you're not complaining, are you, David? He says in 3 days, though, he earned enough money to pay his rent. Now cooks still make $11 an hour. Their rent is 3 times more expensive.
Yeah.
So that's the thing, to get into these fields now that used to be not even necessarily super lucrative, just a position in a career where you felt like you could make a living. No longer, and I know someone else wrote, yeah, the states that I mentioned are changing their minimum wages, and I can't find the person who said it. I'll try to find you, but the correlation there is, yes, if you're going to raise your minimum wage and people will make more money, then they will be able to afford more. That's the thought process. That's what's happening.
The things
everywhere.
rise. You can see, look at the price of milk. The price of milk rises every year, pretty much. So yes, you can make more money, but things will still continue to climb. So there'll always be a discussion around this. There'll always be a conversation, especially now that you got to pretty much pay for everything. And now with education being a factor, a lot of jobs you could get without a college education before. Now that is not necessarily the case, and won't be going forward.
Right.
So.
And then you talk about savings, like I know people in my generation are like, savings, psh, it's like living a paycheck to paycheck now. You got the rent, you got the student loans, you got the clothes you need for the good job, but it's like to save, it becomes really hard. So then it comes into the conversation of, well, okay, let's talk about your debts. Let's talk about your debt to income ratio. How many credit cards have you opened? How many can you close and just pay off? And that's a whole different conversation. So we're all working through it together. I know we're all part of this conversation. We all also